is whether the American-led liberal hegemonic order, to quote Princeton academic John Eikenberry, whether that order is also going to wither away along with the unipolar moment. I am not talking about the decline of the United States as a power. That decline debate remains inconclusive and premature. It will be premature to say the United States is going to decline as the sole superpower of the world. But the order that the United States built since the Second World War is changing in fundamental ways. Some argue, including Professor Eikenberry and some American scholars and pundits, they believe that even if the United States declines itself, the order that it built, the liberal hegemonic order, is going to persist in some form. And it might even co-opt the challenges, countries like China, India, the BRICS. But as I argue in a forthcoming book, which will be released very soon, called The End of American World Order, that hope is mistaken. This is not because the new powers, the emerging powers of the world, have not benefited from the American-led order. But it is because they are not going to, just because they have benefited from their order, that they are going to want to keep it as it is, without demanding and carrying out substantial changes. Because that order has been somewhat unjust, it has been marked by inequality, unilateralism, and exclusion of the rest. This is not to say that some features of the liberal order will not continue, such as the relatively open economies, multilateral institutions, and the advance of democracy. These features are not going to disappear. But the institutional structures, the leadership, and the management of the old order will change. The new order, the emerging order, is not going to be an American hegemony. Indeed, it will be no one's hegemony. Instead, we are going to see what I would call a multiplex world. Not a multipolar world, but a multiplex world, like a multiplex cinema. The term multiplex can be defined as a complex that houses several movie theaters. In a multiplex, there are several movies running in different screens within a single complex. Some of these movies are thrillers and westerns with violence, crime, ruggedness, and heroism as their prominent themes, such as the Hollywood type. Others would have passion, tragedy, song and dance, like the standard Bollywood fare, at least the old Bollywood fare. We would have kung fu films as produced in Hong Kong or Taiwan. We could have patriotic propaganda films as produced in mainland China since the Communist Revolution. There would be plenty of scope for independent films, what is called indie films, alongside films from the established houses like Columbia Pictures or Universal Studios. No single director or producer would monopolize the audience's attention or loyalty. In a multiplex world, the audience will have a choice of shows. The audience can watch or compare several movies at the same time. In reimagining global order today, we are shifting from watching movies in a conventional single-screen theater to a multiplex. The liberal hegemony idea or story is like watching one movie at a time in one theater. After the run of the British, the American movie has been showing for a while, at least for the last 60 odd years. That movie was scripted, produced, and directed by the United States, with itself as the lead actor. In a multiplex world, the American show is going to be joined by a variety of plays with different plots, producers, directors, and actors. The management of order will be more diversified and decentralized, with the involvement of established and emerging powers, middle powers, global and regional institutions, corporations, and transnational non-state actors. Some of them will be heroes, such as non-entrepreneurs promoting human rights and environmental protection. Some of them will be villains, such as Al-Qaeda, drug lords, people smugglers, and greedy corporations. In a multiplex world, there will be hits and flops, like some of the emerging powers, currently so hyped. They may fade away, some of them, because of the middle income trap, because of domestic instability, or hangover from regional conflicts. India, China, Russia, Brazil, all face such risks. The American show may continue to dominate the box office for a while, but the audience might lose interest if it gets a choice. Leadership in a multiplex world is plural and it conducted in different styles and modes. But being under a multiplex also means sharing a common architecture and being in an interdependent relationship. Security screening in multiplex theaters, for example, is done at the entrance to the entire complex, implying collective and common security mechanisms at play. Now, what does this idea or metaphor, it's not a theory but a metaphor of a multiplex world, mean for international studies and international relations in India? And I should qualify that I'm using international studies and international relations almost interchangeably here, mindful of the distinction that international studies is a broader term and stresses the importance of area studies. Now let me tell you how a multiplex world might work in the case of Indian international relations, but also international relations as a discipline. There has been a lot of discussion of the state of international relations in India lately, especially at this institution in JNU. There was a special issue of international studies in 2009, and it's I invite all of you, those of you who haven't read it, to read it. One contributor to that debate, Professor Kanti Bajpai, the former professor at this university, argues that India led the developing world, certainly Asia, in international relations studies from 1947 to late 1980s. But since then, it has lost ground to China, Korea, and Japan. And he lists several obstacles to the advancement of international relations in India, including the neglect of theory, the failure to define a series of animating puzzles, problematics, and problem-solving agendas, the lack of methodological training, the quality of teaching, and the mismanagement of professional life. Another JNU professor, Amitav Acharya, is even more scathing on the state of Indian IR. In his view, while, and I quote, there have been, of course, and continue to be, islands of excellence and inspiration, but these are overwhelmed by mediocrity that seems to define the discipline as it exists today, unquote. While Bajpai finds the reasons for the stagnation of Indian IR in problems peculiar to the discipline and its scholars, Matthew's diagnosis has more to do with institutional factors that plague Indian higher education system as a whole. As with the causes of stagnation or decline of Indian IR, there has been plenty of discussion about the remedies. Some remedies are institutional and relate to providing more resources and funding, and I was just told that the Ministry of External Affairs has provided 25 lakhs of rupees to finance this convention. Well, that's part of the solution, but not the entire solution. Other solutions call for intellectual and conceptual advances and shifts. Some of these suggested remedies stress the need for Indian IR community to take a greater interest in theoretical work. A TV Paul, who is also an alumni of JNU, was my classmate, now in McGill University in Montreal, suggests the need for rigorous theory-driven and theory-informed scholarship. Navnita Behera from Delhi University has explored a number of specific classical and contemporary sources of theory development. Siddharth Mallaprabhu, who is also a faculty member here, has encouraged Indian scholars to build on existing paradigms and develop critical ones. I believe the causes of the underdevelopment of Indian IR and the ways to redress them have been sufficiently well discussed by others to require further elaboration. But what we don't have yet, what we do need, is a sense of what sort of overarching direction the field of IR in India or elsewhere should take. Here I do have a suggestion, drawing upon the theme of my presidency of the International Studies Association, which starts in 3 months. I call it global IR. Let me tell you what I mean by global IR. In a project launched almost a decade ago, a group of scholars, myself included, addressed the question, why is there no non-Western IR theory or international relations theory? 3 aspects of this project, 3 elements or 3 findings of that project are very relevant to the theme of this convention today. First, the project argued that the main theories and concepts of international relations are too deeply rooted and beholden to the history, intellectual tradition, and agency claims of the West to accord more than a marginal place to those of the non-Western world. Second, it explored the reasons for the underdevelopment of international relations outside the West. These included cultural, political, institutional factors when viewed against the hegemonic status of Western international relations studies. And Professor Matthew, Professor Bajpai, and others in the special issue of international studies explored those reasons quite well. Third, the project identified some of the possible sources of building a non-Western international relations, including indigenous history and culture, the idea of nationalist leaders, distinctive local and regional interaction patterns, and the writings of scholars of distinction in and about different regions. The naming, if not the intent or substance of this non-Western IR theory approach has caused some controversy. Some would like to call it post-Western rather than non-Western. I have come to view the new project as part of a inclusive of both non-Western and post-Western, as part of a broader challenge of reimagining IR as a global project. And this is the substance of global IR. It is obvious that in using the term global IR, I'm not calling for renaming the discipline. So much for so long has been written of and about international relations and international studies that it has now become a heritage site that deserves to be preserved. But global IR is not the same as traditional IR that we know. Broadly stated, the idea of a global IR has 6 main dimensions. First, it is inclusive. It calls for international relations to be more authentically grounded in world history and not Western history, and in the ideas, institutions, intellectual perspectives, and practices of both Western and non-Western societies. Second, global IR subsumes rather than supplants the existing Western-dominated international relations. You would know this when it comes to dealing with the non-Western world. International relations is not a monolith or unchanging. For example, constructivism, a relatively new theory of international relations, has been especially important in opening space for scholarship on the non-Western world because of its trace on culture and identity. New variants of realism, such as subaltern realism, neoclassical realism, defensive realism, have rendered realism more relevant to the non-Western world. Increasing trends towards economic interdependence, multilateral institutions, and democratization, which are pathways to global order that liberalism identifies and prescribes, has rendered that theory more relevant to the non-Western world. At the same time, the global IR approach doesn't leave these mainstream theories as is. Instead, it urges them to rethink their assumptions and extend their horizons. For realism, the challenge is to look beyond national interest and the distribution of power. For liberalism, the challenge is to look beyond American hegemony as the starting point of investigating multilateralism and regionalism and their institutional forms. Liberalism also needs to acknowledge the significant variations in cooperative behavior that exist in different regional contexts, and that no single model of regional integration or interactions can account for all or most of them. For constructivism, acknowledging different forms of agency in the creation and diffusion of ideas and norms is a major but unrealized challenge as yet. Third, the global IR designation doesn't mean we should ignore regions, the importance of regions and regionalisms. In fact, global IR gives center stage to regions. While the world is not being fragmented into regions or regional blocks, it is also not moving inexorably towards a seamless globality. A global IR approach calls for the acknowledgement of regional diversity and agency. Regions are no longer viewed in material terms, as fixed geographic entities, but as dynamic, purposeful, and social constructed spaces. Regionalism today is less territorially based or state-centric and encompasses an ever-widening range of actors and issues. The traditional divide between regionalism and universalism may be breaking down. The study of regions is not just about how regions self-organize their economic, political, and cultural space, but also how they resonate and relate to the physical and ideational spaces of other regions and shape global order. Relatedly, the study of regions is central to forging a close integration between disciplinary approaches and area studies. Fourth, global IR calls for a new understanding of universalism or universality. The dominant meaning of universalism or universality is applying to all. One size fits all. It is the perspective of a homogeneous reality. This is the essence of the Enlightenment universalism, whose dark side was suppression of diversity and justification of European imperialism. Rejecting that, I accept Robert Cox's alternative understanding of universalism, which involves, I quote, comprehending and respecting diversity in an ever-changing world, unquote. I call this syncretic universalism, and as I will argue soon, it blends very well with the Indian tradition. Fifth, a truly global IR cannot be based solely or mainly on cultural exceptionalism, and I think the minister referred to the term exceptionalism, or parochialism. Exceptionalism, the tendency to present the characteristics of a social group, a group of states, as homogeneous, collectively unique, and superior to those of others. Claims about exceptionalism in international relations are questionable, not just because of the cultural and political diversity within nations and regions. Such claims are also frequently associated with the political agenda and purposes of a ruling elite, as evident in concepts such as Asian values, Asian human rights, Asian democracy, all of which are rightly associated with authoritarianism. Similarly, exceptionalism in IR can justify dominance of big powers over the weak. American exceptionalism, seemingly benign and very popular at home, is associated or can be associated with the Monroe Doctrine and the self-serving global interventionism of the United States. One strand of Japan's pre-war Pan-Asian discourse, which was founded upon the conception of Asia for Asians, illustrates this tendency as well. China's invoking of the tributary system is pregnant with similar possibilities, since the Pacific nature of the tributary system remains contested. While the development of a national school of IR can broaden and enrich the discipline, if based on exceptionalism mainly, it will challenge the idea or the possibility of a global IR. Finally, global IR takes a broad conception of agency. And here the minister might find some resonance between my theory and his practice. For a long time, international relations theory denied the agency of non-Western states. The non-Western states were considered as objects rather than subjects of international relations. This is not true just of realism, liberalism, or constructivism, the mainstream theories. It's also true of critical theories, including post-colonialism and dependency theories. Can the subaltern speak? Now, that was basically one of the rhetorics of the traditional post-colonial literature. I think the subaltern can speak, and it has spoken. It depends on what we mean by agency. Agency can be material as well as ideational. It can be exercised at the global level as well as regional and local levels. Agency can take multiple forms. It can describe acts of resistance to and localization of global norms and institutions. Agency also means constructing new rules and institutions to support and strengthen global order. Agency means conceptualizing and implementing new pathways to development, security, and ecological justice. Now, using that broader framework of agency, we can find that the South has a voice. To give some examples, Latin American states led the creation of global human rights norms. India and China were on the forefront of creating development norms at the Bretton Woods conferences. Sovereignty was redefined and broadened at the Asia-Africa Conference in Bandung. Africa created a form of regionalism to maintain post-colonial boundaries. India's Jawaharlal Nehru was the first to propose a nuclear test ban. Some of these acts of agency are not just for regions or for the South, but also for global governance as a whole. From the climate change negotiations, we see examples of a common but differentiated responsibility. The idea of human development and the idea of human security were pioneered by South Asians, Mahbub-ul Haq and Amartya Sen. The idea of responsibility to protect, usually attributed to a Canadian-inspired commission, actually had strong African lineage. It owes to the concept of responsible sovereignty attributed to an African diplomat, Francis Deng, who was generalizing from the African context. In sum, international relations has a multiple global heritage that must be acknowledged and promoted. The global IR perspective is inclusive in every sense and across the traditionally understood but increasingly blurred East-West, North-South lines. And it is this conception of global IR that I would propose for the Indian academic and policy community. Why? This brings me perhaps to my most controversial point today. We all know that India is an inclusive nation, democratic nation. What we don't care to admit that India doesn't have a very unique or exceptionalist culture. India is rich in tradition, history, ideas and practices which constitute a key source of global IR. At the same time, these ideas and institutions have proven to be highly exportable and compatible with cultures and norms of other societies and nations. Thanks to its geography, history, culture, a syncretic universalism thrives in India. India has received ideas and culture as much as it has given them to others. Indian ideas during the classical period found their way to Southeast Asia and Central Asia. A powerful example of syncretic universalism is Sufism, as anyone who has visited Dargah Nizamuddin in Old Delhi would know. And yesterday, after I landed in Delhi, I went there as my first visit because I know the pier. I brought a bunch of my students from American University to visit Nizamuddin 3 years ago, and my students are so impressed that they keep asking me to visit and keep asking me to take them back there. It is therefore not surprising that there is little movement towards an Indian school of IR, and I very much hope that it stays that way. This is in marked contrast to the growing demand for a Chinese school of international relations. The Chinese school is based on the Confucianism, Tianxia, the all under heaven concept, the tributary system, and other very distinctive elements of Chinese civilization, politics, and patterns of interaction with the outside world. These have some resonance with its neighborhood, but not much beyond. This makes the idea of a Chinese international relations school limited in its relevance. This is also one of the key limitations of Chinese power. While China is materially growing more powerful every day, it doesn't offer an exportable and attractive ideology for others to follow. What about India? Some argue that Indian international relations should develop by focusing on the rise of India, including the concerns and status that comes with it, just as the Chinese scholars are creating a Chinese school of IR by focusing on the so-called peaceful rise of China. While some of this is understandable and inevitable, pushing this as the central basis of reimagining Indian IR would be a terrible intellectual mistake. As with its history, Indian domestic politics and foreign policy resonates with universalistic norms. India has been a democracy, unlike China, since the Communist Party took over. There have been powerful voices in India against narrow forms of nationalism, which is a cousin of exceptionalism. Rabindranath Tagore was a leading example of this universalistic ethos. Most, though not all, of India's post-war leaders accepted values of political liberalism and security universalism. Nehru was developing the world's most articulate critique of ideological blocs and a key defender of the UN and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Indian non-alignment has been interpreted as both realism and idealism at the same time. But what is often forgotten, that it could be shared with so many countries around the world. It proved to be highly exportable. If Indian foreign policy was truly exceptionalist, then it is unlikely that so many countries around the world would have accepted non-alignment. The Indian IR community should unabashedly embrace and promote this syncretic universalism. It is in this sense that India offers a potentially rich source of the development and advancement of global IR. The global IR approach is especially important in avoiding the trap of exceptionalism and parochialism as Indian IR community strives to overcome its hitherto limitations. And this is the central message I urge you to take from this convention. Thank you for your attention.